firstly to say thank you again, and how nice it is to be in Turku. We haven't been here before. We've known Jan-Erik for quite a few years through our work in England. And this is my colleague Celia Larner, and I'm Ian Hunter. We've been working together for about 28 years. And I did one of the early practice-based PhDs in England in the mid-80s when they were developing PhD research programs. So this work has come out of that PhD. So it's very appropriate that a little later that this work has come out of what really began as a PhD in Manchester. And Celia worked with me on helping with the PhD. So my background is I'm from Ireland. You were English, I think.
I'm extremely English.
You were very okay. And we get along just fine. It's a bit like Swedes and Finns, you know, we kind of have our days. But my background was from Ireland. I spent some 12 years in New Zealand. I was director of the New Zealand National Gallery, so not only a practitioner background, but a background in curatorial work. Very much involved in cultural exchange work in the Pacific. Came back to England in the mid-80s and was fortunate to get a PhD research project at Manchester with the early fellowships. And this project, so Celia and I met in Manchester in 1987, 88, yes. And we decided there was a need for an arts agency, an independent arts agency that would look at the interface between contemporary art practice and social issues, range of social issues. And of course, in England in the mid-80s, it was the post-industrial, that whole sense of the renegotiation of the city and economies, the post-industrial city, the creative economy, and in Britain, multiculturalism. So in a sense, the urban discourse, the rethinking of the city, became the main driver for cultural arts and cultural policy. Our work, although it began working with communities, later moved into cultural policy. Our main area as artists is policy. And there is a discourse in contemporary art practice called art and the public sphere. It's, you know, obviously comes out of critical theory and so on. What we're advocating is art and the policy sphere. And we think interventions in policy are really including cultural policy. And there's all kinds of, it's not a new idea, but this little presentation is about how we accidentally discovered that agricultural policy had been closed off to cultural discourse, and how it could be opened. Hello. So in a sense, it's two stories. It's one that it's about Kirchmüllers and the Merzbau, and it's also about European agricultural policy. Two very improbable alignments, but strangely enough, they happen to intersect again and again. So we offer it as a case study in a practice-led research, artist practice-led research program, but which has ramifications in terms of agricultural policy, and proposes this idea of art and the policy sphere as a new genre. Part of our job as artists doing research is also to anticipate, if you like, new areas of practice and to signal the arrival of those areas of practice, and also the need to develop theory, a body of theory around them, but also where those practices intervene in so-called real-life practices, real-life issues. I think it's partly a North American thing, but certainly a British thing, and I suspect maybe in Finland, where public funding that supported art education and supported university education had a social remit. There was to be a delivery from that investment in terms of social and economic benefits. Not so much instrumentalism, perhaps. So this is one outcome of a PhD in contemporary art practice addressing social issues. But what?
Remember to pause a little
Yeah.
and make sure people are understanding.
A translation is it?
I think we're ready.
Yes. So basically, I'm also from a farming background in Ireland, but having spent 20 years working on cities, it seemed to me there was an opportunity to look at the developments in rural in the agricultural sphere. And of course, within the history of art history, the agricultural experience has been very much present in art. I mean, you have Peter Bruegel, the fallen Icarus, but if you notice the ploughed field, of course the agricultural experience was very much in the foreground. And likewise with Constable, the thing here how artists anticipate social change, but also with an interest in agriculture. Fast forward 200-300 years, the Museum of Modern Art in New York have an exhibition about agriculture. Why? That's quite strange. This is PS1 in Manhattan. It was about 5 or 6 years ago. And Mama said, well, look, we need to be looking at issues in agriculture. And we thought that was really interesting because we have been talking for years about art and agriculture as an emerging genre, which I will talk about in a minute. So this is the Mama PS1 project about agriculture and the city, re-affecting a dialogue between the city and agriculture. So art and agriculture is an emerging genre. I hope to publish the first book on it in 2 years' time, but we'll see. But of course it has an earlier origin. Agnes Dennis, quite a famous American environmental artist. This is Lower Manhattan. I think the buildings are well known. They have both attained another symbolic and political dimension. But this is Battery Park. The expansion of the financial district, the infilling of New York Harbor, and while the land settles, they set up a temporary art program. Art's very interesting because it slots itself into empty spaces politically and ideologically and then withdraws in a sense. So Agnes Dennis, rather than putting a sculpture on the land, decided to cultivate a hectare of New York landfill, and she planted a wheat field. Most of the artists were bringing sculptures, erecting things, making artistic statements. She said, no, I want to go back to the origin. But it was also a political project, because at this time, this is the early 80s, the American farming industry was in crisis. Wheat farmers, the price of wheat had plummeted, and Agnes was, although she lived in Manhattan, had farming connections, and the project was a protest against Wall Street's, the investment, the buying of agricultural futures, and this manipulation of the agricultural sector with social and environmental consequences. So she harvested her plot of wheat. She brought a combine harvester into Manhattan, and she took the wheat to the local Italian bakery. They ground the wheat up, they made flour, they made bread, and they took the bread to Wall Street, into the stock exchange, and served the bread to the brokers with a little message to say, this is our future, that is what you're gambling with. So public art project, agricultural metaphor, so art and agriculture is an established genre. It's getting stronger and stronger, and you will be hearing more about it in due course. That's the background, if you like, to the project. What accelerated our thinking and got the Arts Council and the cultural industry interested in what we were doing was the onset of two animal pandemics. BSE, mad cow disease, which came through in the 90s. And this is one of the reports from the inquiry. And between 80 and 90 people died of Jakob-Creutzfeldt disease. So a sense of a crisis in the agricultural sector where the food chain was being contaminated because of false economies. The British veterinary, this is when Margaret Thatcher had taken over, the veterinary scientific government department was virtually closed down, and contamination of the animal food chain resulted in the prion, VCJD, jumping the food from the animal into humans. So we began, and they say, we're not through the impact of BSE yet. There's another phase to come through. So that notion of a crisis in agriculture, and then a few years later, in 2000, 2001, we had the foot and mouth crisis. where the British livestock industry was virtually wiped out in the space of 6 months. The slaughtering of animals because of the foot and mouth infection. This is Cumbria, which is one of Britain's most attractive landscapes. And during 2001, for about 6 months, as we would drive up and down the motorway, you would see these burning pyres of animals. They hold for the north of England synonymy, like McDonald's, you know, that sort of, and it was the burning of the cows and the sheep. The British economy lost something like £4 billion. I don't know what that is in euros, possibly close to 6 billion euros in the space of 3 months due to the closure of the countryside. That didn't include compensation to the farmers or the health and social consequences, the crisis in agriculture. What we became interested in is how the crisis was being represented in the media through graphs and diagrams to explain what was happening. And as the crisis, it began in March 2001, and by June 2001 the country was at a standstill. It was a major crisis. The election was postponed, farm suicides increased. It was a catastrophe financially.
So did you say that the farmers didn't get any compensation?
They got compensation.
Not at all?
They did. That was in the £4 billion was simply lost revenue to tourism. Then there was the compensation to the farmers.
So it costs more.
It was much more, that's what I'm saying. It was closer to £9 billion. The government's, that's for 5 months of an animal pandemic that could have been prevented. So and of course, so we looked at how the crisis was being represented in the newspapers and so on. We ran a documentation program with the farmers to help the farmers to document the crisis so they could explain what was going on. That little comment on the bottom left-hand corner, bring out the dead, of course is a quotation from the Black Death in the medieval times. And so you began to get references in the newspapers and the media to this notion of a medieval Black Death, so the representation of a pandemic. So our conversation with the Arts Council had begun in late 1990s about looking again at agriculture and the rural sector. This is the head of policy in the Arts Council. It's the lady on the far end beside the bus. That's my colleague Celia. We have 2 farmer representatives. This was the first time that farming leaders had met with our cultural leaders to discuss economy. The Arts Council did say they should make a response. So after the epidemic finished in June, July 2001, the government set up an inquiry and said, we need to examine from every point of view what kind of agricultural policy we have. And so they invited the arts and cultural sector to make a response. So we set up the first meeting, the farmers union, the women farmers, to meet with the Arts Council people. And the agenda was, the government has called for a national response to help the nation recover economically and socially. So what is to be the cultural response? And that's really where our work sort of came together. And the Arts Council and the Cultural Ministry said, look, if we made the arguments, they said, well, why should the cultural sector get involved in this, what is effectively an agricultural crisis? It's the responsibility of the Agricultural Ministry. We say, no, it's a cultural responsibility as well. And these were the key arguments that we put forward. Agriculture sits at the heart of culture. It's about life. It's the sphere of cultural practice. But for the cultural sector, we had to make the arguments the other way. We had to persuade artists in the urban cultural sector that they should get involved with this new discourse. And one of the arguments we used, which appeals to academics as well as to artists, is that embedded in the discourse of agriculture are ethical, aesthetic, and social agendas. They were there, if you like, biotechnology, there was ethical dimension. So it wasn't just pandemics, it was much more sophisticated. To define the crisis in British agriculture in the early 2000s was, of course, pandemics, the whole issue of GMO and genetic engineering, of course, reform of the agricultural policy, AU. It was an economic and a social adjustment. Obviously, zoonoses, FMD, swine flu, climate change, and there were many others. What we were really saying to the cultural ministry is, look, the crisis in agriculture is at its heart a social and cultural crisis. We in the arts and cultural sector address the urban issues of the restructuring of the urban. Why should we not address the agricultural? And this was the definition of the crisis. And then the methodology, if you like. So then the question then came back to us, okay, if you artists want to get involved in this, tell us how you think you could go about doing that. And the little project I want to finish off today is the first one, ArtBarns, which was really a pilot project to try and work out what is the best way for predominantly urban-based artists and curators and academics to engage with the farming and agricultural sector, given there had been no interface between cultural policy and agricultural policy. What we said was, agriculture has been closed off to the cultural discourse. Why? So it needs to be looked at. So the ArtBarns is the one I'm just going to talk about now. So the Arts Council said to us by 2001, okay, we accept your argument, we put all our money into the cities, we've had a talk to the farmers, we've talked to the agricultural ministry, there's an agreement in principle that we think artists and the art sector should engage with these issues, but we need to do it under controlled circumstances. So the project was very simple. Do you want to talk a little bit about that? This is the area where we live near Manchester. It's a big rural area called the Forest of Lowland. Mainly hill farmers, and I don't know very much about Finland, but our hill farmers who live about 800 meters up are possibly the most vulnerable social, and within the farming sector, the most vulnerable. They're tenant farmers, they don't own their farms, they're unable to earn a living, it's their wives that keep the economy going, they're kind of marginal, that is, from the rural sector. And at that point, because we had the old Labour government, the socialist government, part of their cultural rhetoric, their government rhetoric was about social inclusion. But they meant black people and Muslims and African Caribbeans. We said, what about the hill farmers? And they went, but they're white. We said, no, they're also socially and economically deprived. But the hill farmers had not developed a cultural language with which to explain their position. It wasn't for us to speak for them. We wanted to set a project up, so that became ArtBarns. The inspiration for ArtBarns was very simple, because now we shift into the artistic practices. The Arts Council funding officers, they're good people, they're intelligent. When we went to them for funding, they said, well, we just can't give you funding like this for a project with hill farmers, even though socially and economically it's you have to give us an artistic precedent. We can't just, because we don't fund projects on farms. They were quite resistant to that. Well, we're not going to fund them. I mean, we do cities, we build museums, we have sexy contemporary art spaces, we have wine bars. Our culture is fine. Why should we go? So we said, well, listen, come back with a precedent. It was your idea, wasn't it?
It's definitely my idea.
And we thought, we said, well, wait a minute. There was this famous Dada artist called who also happened to have come to the northwest of England as a refugee from the Nazis. This is a little farm barn inside your shed in the back end of rural Cumbria, quite a remote area. Between 1946 and 1947, he carried out an incredible experiment in that little barn, which influenced the course of contemporary art practice.
Would you have got a picture?
I have a picture coming later. So we went back to the Arts Council and said, we have a precedent for you. They went, okay, what have you got? Kurt Schwitter's. I went, okay, right, ArtBarns. So you could choose famous art. So all they were interested in was, if they were going to give us money, that the artist would get the money, and the artist could make art, and it wouldn't be contaminated by this thing called agriculture. They were quite clear that they wanted art. So we used a subterfuge, but we used the argument of Schwitter's to get the money to work. So the project became ArtBarns. And this is the beginning of the project. And basically what it boiled down to was we had about, was it 80,000 pounds, about maybe 120,000 euros, not that much, but you know, enough. And the arrangement with the farmers, we spoke to the leader of the farmers, and they said, yes, it's a great idea. We need to be able to explain what we're doing. We don't know much about art, but we're happy to meet with the artists. And the idea is we rented the barns in each of the farms. We paid, the farmers got paid for the use of their barn, because their barns were mainly empty. This is one of the farming leaders, the whole farming leaders. And of course, there's these beautiful empty, the traditional barns were empty because farm machinery had got so big, the big combines. Of course, there were many empty farm barns. Those of you that remember your creative industries, kind of, or creative economy, Sharon Zucken's book about the loft culture in Manhattan, where in the 1950s, 1960s, when the textile industry in Manhattan came to an end and it moved out to Brooklyn, they left behind empty lofts, and into the lofts moved artists. And you got the beginning of that creative cluster in Manhattan, out of which then came this notion of the creative economy, the urban creative economy. We have the emptying out of the countryside. We have new spaces opening up in the rural sector, both physically but also intellectually, into which the cultural sector can move. That was the premise of ArtBarns. We're talking about the post-agricultural era. Doesn't mean the end of agriculture. It means the rethinking of agriculture from cultural perspectives. So we did an inventory of all the barns, and then gave them to the artists. The artists would live on the farm, and they would come up with ideas to make artworks in the barn. So, of course, the Arts Council were happy because they were getting art. And the artists were happy because they had an empty barn to work in, and they could make art. And nothing wrong with that, except we raised the bar slightly, and we said to the artists, you have two choices. You can use the barn, or they love the barns, artists love empty spaces. And we said, you have two choices. You can talk to the farmers, and they thought that was really good because they lived on the farm, and find out from the artist or from the farmer what their concerns are or their problems, and you can address that farming problem. Or you can do an artwork in honor of Kurt Schwitters. And most of them went with the farming. This project is not really an art project. What it's about at that point, price of wool, sheep's wool, had gone down to 1 penny a kilo. That's, I don't know, that's 48% of a euro. I mean, it was ridiculous. The farmers were burning the wool in the fields. It cost the farmers more, it cost them £1.50 or €2 to clip the sheep, and they were only getting 1 penny for the wool, so they started burning. It was a national crisis. So the artists decided to make an issue of the surplus wool. Okay, this is the local farmer.
Explain what was in that barn.
What was in the barn?
Wool.
Well, yes, we've got that.
The farmer was paid for his entire wool clip that year.
So we used the Arts
The
Council.
artist used it.
So we used the
The
Arts
Arts
Council
Council money went to
to
buy
buy the wool. So the artist made the installation, but the British Wool Marketing Board got to hear about it. That the people in the white jacket, the lady in the pink, they're from the British Wool Marketing Board. They heard about the project. They said, this is great. We need to raise them. So they came over, met the artist, talked to the farmer, and they said, we would like to run a conference at the same time about creative uses of wool. And this is what happened. So the Wool Board came in on top of the project, ran a seminar for the farmers to explain to the farmers how they could add value to their wool. So they said, we hadn't planned that, it's sort of the project. So that was the model we were interested in, where, yes, the artwork could happen, but the economic and social dimension of the project would take off in a different direction. Other artists made very clear artistic statements. This is a traditional farm barn. He's a poet, and he's made a neon poem in honor of Kurt Schwitters. It deals with Schwitters' experience as a collage artist. And of course, he put the neon inside for the sheep. He said, well, you know, I don't make art for people, I make art for sheep. So the sheep had their own artwork. And one of the interesting feedbacks at the end of the project was we asked the farmer at the end of the project, 2 months later, how did you like the project? He said it was really good. Many, many people came. He said, but you know, a lot of people came because they thought it was a cafe. And he says, I'm going to start a cafe. And he hadn't thought of that, so because the light, it happens. Because we live in Manchester, is a culturally diverse city, we arranged for an African artist, the woman in the green scarf, also to work with some of the hill farmers. This is barbecue with English lamb and African plantain, and it's halal slaughtered lamb, and the farmer was anxious to sell his lamb to new markets, and he hadn't thought of selling it to the African and Asian communities in Manchester, who are very particular about having fresh food. So this project developed into a food market. The African women came out of Manchester. What was interesting here is, and I know it's something that people are dealing with in Finland, but the negative perceptions of refugees or migrants, and of course there's a tendency, most of the migrants are clustered in the cities. Of course, many of these migrants are from rural backgrounds and from a livestock culture, and we brought them up into the hill farms. You had a marginal English community who were marginalized by the urban. They had no contact with the urban. They were considered not degenerate, but kind of, culturally inferior people, meeting with, inverted commas, culturally, people from unusual backgrounds. I think made an immediate connection through the rural experience and through livestock and through food and through children. It was an unexpected, so the women, the African women, instead of being corralled and marginalized and ghettoized in the city, they find a new outlet and a new connection. And so 2 problems became a solution. And we're very proud of that project. And then John, so there was an economic outcome here as well, because John, of course, was a struggling farmer. He produced milk, he produced meat, and through the African community and the refugee community in Manchester, he found new markets for his milk and his food. Okay. That basically, there was many other case studies in the ArtBarns project. This is the final gallery. You have artists, farmers, still farmers, media people. It was a celebration of the project. For the English Arts Council, because at this point, 2002, the lottery had really, the English cultural lottery had just really had been running for 5 years. We're talking of something in the region of maybe 500 million euros a year. 500 million euros a year, only for art. Disbursed by about 30 civil servants, and it all went to urban project, virtually every penny. Our project was an intervention in cultural policy. We had said to the Arts Council, look, the rural and agricultural sector is struggling. We would like to run a pilot project that would demonstrate how lottery money could be used. And of course, in the year of 1999, which was the year we did this project, the government, Parliament, the British Parliament, had set up a committee of inquiry because they were concerned that the lottery money was being abused. It was going to too many prestige gallery projects. It was going mainly to the cities, and it was going mainly to middle-class people. The only project the Arts Council could offer to the committee of MPs to justify their expense was this project. And that was something like less than 120,000 euros. So it was very interesting. So it worked as an intervention. Just to finish off, because we're almost finished now, I said it was about two stories. You've seen how the ArtBarns project alerted the Arts Council and the cultural sector and the cultural ministry to this notion of the renegotiation of agriculture was not just a technical or economic or social problem, it needed a cultural response. And that if you like, the precedent by which they could assemble a cultural response was the response they made to the cities, the restructuring of the post-industrial economy. That's what ArtBarns showed them, and the need for a cultural strategy. The second thing that ArtBarns did was alerted the rural leaders, the farming leaders, the National Farmers Union, the Women's Rural Leader, to the fact that they had a cultural voice. They knew they had a cultural voice. They didn't need us, but how to connect that cultural voice with the dominant urban culture that was making the decisions about the funding for agriculture and culture. So the farming leaders set up a rural cultural forum. They then came to the table and said, we want our cultural equity. And the government had never thought of that before. So, but we're still artists, and having invoked Kurt Schwitter's reputation and name and methodology, at the end of 1999, of course, perhaps not the farmers, but many of the artists said, now we must pay attention to Kurt Schwitter's. It was something that we had been aware of, but it wasn't a major aspect of our work. But having set up museums, I know how to set up museums, I know how to program museums, I know how to make cultural arguments for museums. But I got out of that business 20 years ago because it wasn't for me. And all of a sudden we found ourselves thinking, well, why is Kurt Schwitter's missing from the British discourse of modernism? Henry Moores there, the great British modernist. I'm sure in Sweden or in Finland you have your great modernist artists. In Britain, they have all been celebrated with major museums. Kurt Schwitter's was British. He applied and became a British citizen shortly before he died as a response to Auschwitz and Belsen. He said, I will never go back to Germany. I repudiate Germany and I will stay in England and I want to. So there is very few references. So our project then switched and became one of raising the profile of Kurt Schwitter's. Why? He was a refugee. And in Britain there's still a bit of uncertainty and obviously there's anxieties everywhere about how do we deal with refugees? I mean, how do we, there's a sense of the discourse of containment, displacement, you know. And here's a great modern artist who made a significant contribution to European culture, to British culture. This is all there is to represent them. It's a broken down barn, a little white building which was his studio, which is falling down.
Is it possible for you to give a short resume of the earlier Merz project?
The what?
The earlier Merz project.
Oh, forgive me.
The people who
yes,
don't know about that, this is a kind of a last part of it.
Sorry, forgive me. You're quite right. Of course, next year is the 100th anniversary of the birth of Dada, which is really the birth of modern art in 1916 in Zurich, where the avant-garde of that period, their reaction against World War I, and of course they had this cabaret in Zurich, and out of that became this movement called Dada, which really was the origin of modern art. Tristan Tzara, Hugo Ball, all of that, a tremendous and extraordinary explosion, which really became formalized in the 20s. Kurt Schwitter's, although he wasn't at the Cabaret Voltaire, he wasn't in the Zurich moment of the finding of Dada, came along 2 years later. He's one of the key Dada artists, one of the top, and of course he ends up in England working on his last experiment. What he was most famous for, and we're used now in terms of modern architecture with Rem Koolhaas and Zaha Hadid, but Schwitter's was one of the pioneers of early modern architecture and is still credited by all the leading architects today as one of the major influences. And it was his experiments inside little buildings, and in this case, this little farm barn at the back end of Cumbria, where he carried out his last experiment in 1947. These are the people that worked with him. He's in the black suit, and his girlfriend is second from the left, a local farmer who rented him a barn, Hilda Goldschmidt. This is the story. This is the outcome of Hitler declaring modern art degenerate. 1937, the Antarctica Coast, driving artists, poets, one of the great catastrophes of European early modernism. They were driven from their studios and homes. Many of them stayed on. A few collaborated with the Nazis. Most of them went to the United States. And quite a few came to Britain. And yet, out of that catastrophe came the seeds of what we now call the Great Modern Project, of which we're the beneficiaries as professionals in the cultural sector. So where is the museum to this extraordinary artist? There isn't one. So this is his little barn, which he rented And inside this, he produced an extraordinary artwork. I mean, I haven't time to go into the details. There were covered all four walls and the ceiling. This is what he finished just before he died in 47 in this damp little barn. He already produced 3 other Merz-Balls, 2 in Norway, one of which survives on the island of Jatahoya outside Molde in Oromsdal, and that they're creating a museum to Kurt Schwitter's in Norway. His German home in Hanover have created a museum. We are lobbying the British government as we speak to create a centre to honor Kurt Schwitter's, and we've raised the money to buy the barn and the farm. Where did the money come from? Agri-Merz. Why? Most of the British artists living today, and certainly European artists, and I would imagine Finnish artists as well, would almost say unanimously, amongst the other great modern pioneers, Kurt Schwitter's was extraordinary. What an extraordinary human being. To have stood up to the Nazis, a bit like Walter Benjamin, living out of a suitcase in the last 10 years of his life. Major, major influence. So when we set up a fundraiser, by 2005, having used Kurt Schwitter's memory, having used his legacy to launch the farming project, we thought we owe this artist a debt. So then we ran a couple of conferences at Tate. The Tate said, yes, we must do something. And we then ran a fundraising campaign. And the phone rang. You want to tell the story about what happened when the phone rang?
The phone rang, and in England we have an awful lot of what we call nuisance calls. Companies ringing up, marketing, trying to sell you windows, this and that. So we're quite brusque with them like this. So the phone rang, and Ian was actually on the motorway up to the Lake District. So I take it, and I'm listening, and I'm thinking, is this a marketing call? What is this call? And there's a woman on the other end, and she's asking me all these questions about our little charity that we run, a not-for-profit business. And I say, well, excuse me, who are you? You can have the answers, but who are you? And she said, we're Science Limited. So I'm thinking, Science Limited, what are they selling? And then she said, well, actually, Damien Hirst is minded to give you a painting. So then the first thing I said was, oh, couldn't he just give us money? This painting is going to be a nuisance. Well, she said it has to be auctioned, right? How are we going to... No, it has to go through Sotheby's. And I'm thinking, oh, this is more... And then she said, it is worth between 80 and 120,000 pounds. And I went, oh, hang on. And I said, I'm sorry, the boss is out of the office. May I give you his number? And I put the phone down, then immediately I picked it up and I rang Ian, who luckily answered the mobile, because he doesn't usually, and said, Ian, you're going to get a phone call. Just park yourself in a lay-by somewhere and wait for it and tell them I'm the girl in the office and I'm new. And that's how they were deciding what size of a spin penny to give us, and they gave us an 8-foot one, which is very big.
I mean, another artist contributed as well, and so did a major foundation. We ended up buying a farm with Kurt Schwitter's Merz farm, with this implication of looking at his legacy, and as I say, it was funding from Damien Hirst. So we bought the place. It's about 4.7 hectares, just under 5 hectares, but it's in a national park. It's a very, very beautiful location, relatively remote, but it has this extraordinary cultural resonance with Schwitter's. And then we began looking at ways to raise the I'm finishing. We're in the last couple of minutes now of the talk. We know how to run major company projects, but suddenly the sense that Kurt Schwitter's had not been properly honoured by the British establishment. It wasn't that he was rejected in a very British way. They just let him drop out. Being Irish, I'm interested in, sort of marginality and colonialism. So I thought, well, how do we bring Kurt Schwitter's back? So we began lobbying, and one of the first things that quite accidentally had happened was the Royal Academy. Now this is interesting because we then started to talk to the leaders of the British establishment, Nicholas Sirota, the director of the Tate, and you go to them and you say, look, we're doing something about Kurt Schwitter's. The immediate response is, that's really interesting. What can we do to help? And what did you tell Sirona?
I said he needs an exhibition at Tate.
And he agreed. He said, just like that. He's from a Jewish refugee background. Of course he understands. It's very important. So one of our coups, if you like, I mean, how to position Kurt Schwitters, the marginal, the refugee, the German, the forgotten, the remote, the rural. How do you bring that? Here he is, right in the centre of the British establishment. This is the forecourt of the Royal Academy. I mean, that is the central, the quintessential centre of the British cultural establishment. How did that happen? We don't claim the credit. Penelope Curtis, who was recently director of Tate Britain, was then director of the Hindu Research Centre, and we brought her up to the Agri-Merz barn, a very straight-laced art historian, Courtauld Institute, very proper, and she said, "You're absolutely right. Kurt Schwitters has been forgotten. I will change this." And she was curating the British Sculpture Show, 100 years of British sculpture, and who was the guest of honor? Kurt Schwitters. And they built his little Merz barn in the corner in the forecourt. It was there for 3 months.
From a little shed, they built a replica.
They built a replica.
In part of Piccadilly.
But you remember, of course, we're still trying to help the farmers. So the Royal Academy said, well, we're going to, and this is not to be taken as anti-Polish, but in Britain, the Polish people do all the work. And they said, we'll employ some Polish builders. And we said to the Royal Academy, no, you won't. And they said, how dare you? I said, you will employ some English farmers who built it, and so we got the farmers the contract. So the farmers from the valley got the contract.
We used our stone too.
And they used their own stone as well. So, forgive me. We're on the stage now, and so there it was. So this is the leader of the county council, Celia, on the opening night, and of course all the British establishment were there, I mean in their droves. And as they walked past the Merz barn, they all looked up and said, wonderful, he's arrived. Literally, he arrived. And then to finish off, he persuaded Tate Britain, this was Celia's achievement, she persuaded the Tate had a major, yes, we owe Kurt Schwitters, so the British establishment developed the narrative, not us. So the Tate writes the narrative. Kurt Schwitters was British. Kurt Schwitters came to Britain. This is Ute Bauer, one of the great European curators. She also came up and she got interested. So, not because of us, because of Kurt Schwitters. His time has come. So, and then our final conference was housing words. So this is 5 years later. We're looking at this notion of what kind of institution should we create to honour an artist of his great stature. Should we build, and of course, part of the conference, this is one of the seminars in the conference, the young lady in the black jacket beside the word processor, the laptop, is a young architect from a refugee background, Natasha Reid, and she was at the Tate conference explaining from her refugee point of view what would be the best way to honour Kurt Schwitters. Of course, the British establishment's way of marking the importance of their pioneer modern artists or to build these prestige museums. 500, like 80 million euros, 90, no problem. Henry Moore, the Tates and Ives, dozens of museums. Kurt Schwitters, nothing. So we asked Natasha, and she said, well, there's 2 ways we can do this. We can build a temporary Kurt Schwitters gallery outside the Tate. So this tradition of building pavilions. So this was her proposal, and the Tate had accepted it. While the Kurt Schwitters exhibition the main exhibition was inside the Tate, we were going to build a temporary pavilion that was going to tell the story of Kurt Schwitters, the refugee. Okay. So it didn't happen, but and this is our final, very, very modest proposition for a little temporary gallery beside the Merz barn, the Merz shed, 60,000 euros, 70,000 euros. We think we can do it. Thank you.
That's the Merz barn in the garden.
Thank you very much for listening, and I hope it was of interest.
Well, let's start talking then.
No. Finish people don't talk.
Well, you're familiar, we don't talk.
But you think about it.
But of course, you have to, in your mouth, probably you say something in relation to your background. I was thinking, how would this kind of logic look like in Finland? And then I somehow immediately came and put this into a background of so-called Scandinavian art policies. And from the start, at least it looked like that for several decades, that there's this arm's length policy in shape and in power, but it's been now somehow, for many reasons, somehow crumbling in different ways. And the one is that the funders and also the state funding is taking up more and more policy programs where they somehow thematically start dealing out that they would like to see something happen in this area, this area, this area. And this is, I think, a trend which is getting stronger. I can't go into details, but then there's another kind of development which, at the side of this, is this issue of instrumentalism. And I think that's that instrumental way of seeing art as useful. This has grown much stronger in the, for example, in the latest government programs for art we should be used for. And how that will be implemented is probably through state funding, creating more and more policies, not really leaving the artists to do what they like, but to have kind of folders where to put your work in, and then the private foundations who also fund a lot of art and culture. In Finland especially, we have several big foundations. They have quite outspokenly folders you have to somehow think about. Could I ask for money? Then I have to find myself talking about this and to be able to go on. But these interests don't really show up in the art education so much. For example, we have one university, Lapland University, who have had an experiment with the 2 years MA in applied arts, applied visual art. It was an intriguing concept. It happens so that they have also in the same university a program where service design is a strong program there. And that comes from the area of design, and that's much more understandable for Finns because we have a strong sector of design. And it has somehow developed in many ways, but in the University of Art and Design it developed also into interface design, and then you generalize this interface, then you are very sudden in the service design. And since this was an education line in Lapland, the art teacher teaching programs applied something of this logic into there and founded the art applied visual arts. But they had to get their professor from Glasgow, from areas where these issues, and in UK these issues have been dealt with for a long time, to have a connection between urban, social reconstruction, all that, to have artists working there, also for employment, but also for betterment of burnout areas like in Glasgow or Edinburgh or before the cultural capital program. So they had to have experts. They have still an English professor there in Lapland. So we have this instrumentalism development, and then we have this arm's length, getting shorter and shorter and disappearing. But for those of us like myself, we have been schooled and trained in urban art is something urban, and so the environmental art education in University of Art and Design, as long as it existed, now it's within the Aalto University. It doesn't exist really anymore. The environmental art education somehow were able to use in their projects the environment and rural areas, but it's more or less kind of an exotic kind of combination to sculpture parks, things like that. So we are really not up to this kind of connection in really. I would say that what you are presenting here is something new for us. more or less, but we know the logic behind that, and it is reaching us at the moment we speak, that we should be useful in many ways. For me, I'm raised in being useful or having my next gallery show in the White Cube. So how to get out of the White Cube?
Somebody has to do it.
But there is also a barn tradition in Finland.
That's right.
It's called the summer exhibitions.
Yes.
It really went down. I think the interest in that went down for several years, and it doesn't really exist the same way as it still did exist in the 80s and beginning of 90s. But there are still some spots outside the big cities who are now raising their own momentum for showing international or Finnish contemporary art, but the artists come from Helsinki, more or less, or around the cities in Finland, which there are some. But these issues really, they are new to us. Now we have, of course, quite for our scale, a huge refugee problem at the moment. And it's not solved, and I could see here, suggestions to what we end up in confronting ourselves. How should we tackle the refugee problem with cultural means?
Just very, very quickly.
No, I'm finished.
No, don't forget that autonomy is another form of instrumentalism.
Autonomy. Yeah, it's like yes, but it's kind of that's the safe area we used to play with our tools, and we have our museums and galleries. But that's another. Of course, it's not neutral. It's not instrumental. I agree completely. But the sector is quite small.
And I don't think we've got time, but anyway, the other question you haven't asked me is, what happened? And
But Jan-Erik is going to do that.
No. And of course, the Culture Ministry and the Rural Ministry have rejected these ideas completely.
Really?
Yes. Absolutely. And it's partly the new political government, but after all of that work, I didn't want to leave you with the sense that the English are doing these amazing things. Our bureaucracies, they're old imperial bureaucracies. Don't forget that. What used to be Africa and Uganda and India is now health, social and education. And the bureaucracies are very powerful. They have decided to kill this off. And we're using political means. But right now, it's not going to happen. That notion of a cultural intervention into agriculture, not for political reasons, it's to do with power. Power operates in government.
It's easy to run things in the cities.
Yeah. So it's not a success story. It's an interesting proposition. But right now, I'll be honest and say, it looks like it's been a failure.
It's a pity.
Yes.
Because I think we have the same situation in Finland. The farmers are not well off. On the contrary, because of the globalization and everything and the competition and so on. So they are greatly marginalized, especially up in the north and the center of Finland and up into the north. In the south of Finland, we have these very big farming industries, they could manage. But the smaller farmers,
The families.
So it would be nice to try something like your experiment in Finland also. I think we could draw good ideas from your experience.
One of the reasons it's very important to talk about it, and why we will always try and go and talk about the ideas, because it may well be that the little sparks are left and that they get taken on in completely different contexts from where we originally. Because it's quite clear that we are right. It is right. It will happen. There will be, because the whole of agriculture is crumbling under the idea that it is run only for economic reasons. Whoever perpetuated that myth? Why would you run anything only for money, which is nothing? No, you have to take your cultural and your whole holistic thing on when you're deciding to do anything. And things are foundering at the moment, and to say nothing about the World Bank, you know, the whole financial system. It's nonsense. So you have to start somewhere in attacking it.
But now when the rents in the bigger cities like London and Helsinki are so high that artists can't live there anymore, like especially sculptures, where you need a lot of space.
Yes.
Is there any this kind of that people move, like artists move out and take these old barns and so on?
They call it, yeah. I mean, there is a lot of that happening, and that notion of empty space. But of course, again, because England, maybe more than Finland, is very densely populated, huge population, concentrated, and living in the rural areas is becoming impossible because urban dwellers buy up rural cottages or villages. So there's a kind of double. I mean, it's quite serious. The government's trying to bring in a second home thing. So ordinary working people cannot afford to live in the rural villages anymore. Seriously. So there's a double, the spread out from London, because not just artists, people can't, ordinary, middle class people can't live in London anymore. They can't afford the rent. So they're moving, it's...
because the whole problem is not just London. There are small towns in Harrogate. They have to bus their dustbin emptiers in, because there's nobody poor enough in the city itself. It's not even a city, it's a town. There's nobody poor enough to do the jobs that rich people don't want to do.
It's very different here now. At the moment, you can get very cheap, very nice buildings,
That's
not
different
very
here.
far from Helsinki, actually. So it's a very good moment here for artists to move out from the cities.
But could I ask, just getting back to the reasons for the failure, would you say that the power questions were somehow formed by the foundations of this? Who were giving it's a state organization, this art councils, okay, but are they lobbied then by the strong museum people who want to keep the art in their crumbling organizations in the cities, because everything's getting more expensive there, so they don't really want to have any new distributions of the resources.
And what about the artists themselves? Are there enough power or many artists that would support such a program, or not? If you don't have the power from behind or below, it's
I mean, it is true. It is a failure, but I mean, it's an honourable failure. I mean, as in scientific research, the failures reveal, where the weaknesses are in the discourse, but they also tell you how to renegotiate your strategy. The problem for us was that, this is a very simple presentation. I mean, we put 10 years of lobbying with government, with ministers, with both political parties, and setting up a world for the farmers. Very sophisticated, we really did it really professionally. Our problem was the socialist government, who weren't necessarily pro-rural, understood it as a social inclusion issue. They were, they looked at the evidence, they were evidence-based, and they said, you're right. And in 2010, when we had the last year of the socialist government, we were able to get the culture minister and the rural minister to agree to make a government policy. And it was actually written in it was accepted, it was policy, they just had to win the election. Now, we weren't done. We went to the opposition party and we talked to the centre right, and we went through it with them, and they said, of course we agree, but they were liars. Because when they got elected, the first thing they did was say, oh yeah, we'll deal with that later on. The bureaucrats and the civil servants, as we call them, in the culture ministry and in the rural ministry said, politicians don't support you, we don't have to do it. They were just lazy. So you know, and then, so we've been lobbying with we have a coalition government. So we've been lobbying politically, but the key thing is there is a powerful group of artists. It's actually the problem of professionalism, vested interests. One large group of artists who have a particular interest in doing rural projects a certain way lobbied the Arts Council, and they were quite happy to go with that. We lost the political battle, and then the farming leaders lost hope. I mean, they said, look, Ian, we're too busy. You know, we've got to keep the crops in the field. This culture thing, it's a great idea, but you know, we've got to get on with it. So that's what happens. You know, it's just life. You know.
But this certainly this kind of happening.
Yeah.
If your information,
yeah.
I mean, not only from this presentation,
yeah.
but we can somehow, with the laboratory, get hold on. That would be really interesting to apply this discussion, these questions on the situation, for example, in Finland. And I think Jan-Erik will take care of.
Well, that's why
collecting the information, because that would be quite.
Come on, man, you are intellectual.
Sure, but I'm looking at it. But this is of course a part of a discussion which is going on, but here and there. Actually, for us, there are our state art councils, the personal. It's called Taike.
Yeah.
It's distributed all. They are really our friends.
Oh yeah.
Because I don't mean like Jan-Erik is my friend, but they are friends of artists. We know that now that we are in the same boat. They also have a problem of getting the money for it, but they are supporting that fight because they want to further the art. So this instrumentalism discussion is quite a hard issue at the moment in Taike, for example, with its new organization, 2 years old, 3 years old.
It just, I mean, it's a long evening, and I know you've been wonderful listeners. 2 suggestions, I mean, in terms of research, okay? I mean, we will eventually rebuild the English project, we will keep it going. It will come back. It will take us another 3 years. It will come back. 2, if I had we had a research place like this, 2 research, one of which Finland is very good at. When the creative economy discourse, the creative industry discourse, was at its height 5 years ago, one of the best critiques of the creative industries came from a conference in Helsinki. A bunch of Finnish academics, and you had the Americans and the Canadians. You know, obviously Richard Florida, you know, became a guru of the creative economy. I mean, it's become. I mean, it's a powerful, and the British government bought it completely. One of the most intelligent and effective critiques came out of Helsinki 4 years ago, and I read it and I thought that's brilliant. Really, really good. The creative rural economy, is the next big one. And somebody in Europe should run. I gave it to the Dutch, we talked to the Dutch government, their rural ministry. They're putting a conference together. They have the Dutch presidency. So we're giving it a term, or European conference. Look, go with it. The other conference, the other great research area is culture and pandemics. Bird flu, avian flu, BSE, the rise of animal pandemics is a reflection of the wrong agricultural policy worldwide. So how do we deal with pandemics, which are increasing in frequency and increasing in virulence? And so if you look at agriculture, look at the sphere of agriculture, biotechnology, creating new life forms, pandemics, a threat to the very existence of human beings, a new concept of economy. That's all embedded in the agriculture. Intervening in agriculture is not just helping farmers. Yes, it's helping farmers. There are key philosophical, ethic. It's a rich field for academics. Don't worry about the farmers.
But it is a frightening field, and
yes.
The one conference we ran on pandemics, which was to do with the foot and mouth, and we had an exhibition of our documents of the foot and mouth thing. With one, and then we had a conference and we had veterinarians from all
vets
over,
and scientists
and scientists and artists together
and politicians.
in Manchester Town Hall. And the first people who turned up were the Secret Service.
Yes, the MI5. I know, think about this.
The Monsanto guys.
You know, one of our lecturers, one of our speakers, was a British academic who led the American government's animal, it's called bioterrorism. Have you heard of agro-terrorism?
Yes.
Bioterrorism. Well, we had one of our lectures was advertised. And we had this visit from these guys with funny bits of plastic sticking, out of their ear, talking into their phones, and they were walking around, and they were from MI5, and they came to check out the conference. And but it was advertised. We actually sent, because I knew what would happen, so I sent MI5. I got their address, and I sent them an invite to the conference, and they came. And they realized that it was, not a. So it's very interesting. It's curious. Isn't it interesting where artists end up? Isn't it fascinating? They stick their nose in other people's business. Sorry.
Well, we are here.
Did you enjoy it? Was that useful? Did you find that useful?
Yes, very inspiring. I could see a lot of connections. I work in design field.
Oh, you're in design.
Yes,
yeah.
and I'm very much into agriculture also because so much of the fibers we source come from agriculture. Wool and
Absolutely. Yeah.
and fiber, metal, linen.
Yes.
And I would love to do a project with I even tried to start something because I work as a teacher at another university of applied sciences, where we also have a department for agriculture, but we haven't got funding, and I would like to try to diversify the fiber selection because over 90% of the fibers you can get today are cotton.
Exactly.
We don't have the choice. And it's possible to grow, for example, hemp in Finland, and it's done, but not the textile, and it doesn't exist anymore because it's there. But I know that you have in England there's a bioregion, I think.
Bioregional project.
Yes, I'm very interested in that.
And just to we ran a conference on farming and fiber textiles. The whole idea of the relationship between agriculture and fashion, the textile industry. You're absolutely, and what the farmers say, which really, farmers are highly amazing. They say, Ian, because when we talked to them, they said, people don't understand how important we farmers are. And I said, what do you mean? He said, we do 4 important things. He said, first of all, we harvest the sun. That's what we take the sun and we make it into useful things. I said, tell me, fiber, protein, we generate culture, and we generate products for the building industry, and we do all of this on our own, and people don't understand. So that idea of fiber, protein, and culture, and energy. So farmers produce 4 things from the sun. Quite amazing. So when the farmer explained it to me like that, we farm the sun. That just becomes. Jan-Erik, thank you very much for inviting us.
Well, of course. I mean, perhaps a few words. You were lecturing in Oulu. They have some kind of silo project. Perhaps like a short. What are they doing there?
We bring you news.
That's we don't know what's happening.
News. Very interesting project there. It's the silo project by the famous. And a group of artists in there, and they're doing what we have just been talking about. So it's already happening.
In Oulu.
Oh, yes, very sophisticated, very similar to what we're doing with Kurt Schritter's, in re-invoking an icon of pioneering work of Finnish modernism, which is already.
We don't know this silo.
We came from England to see the silo. That's how important it is. And
we should go there.
Farmers
through the roof.
yes,
Yes.
but it's
circular things. Yes.
It's one of them. I mean, Corbusier, he designed. No, it's not him. He wasn't as good as.
It's got this amazing end.
Yes.
And when you go in, there are buckets full of dripping water, and it's all ideas. But there
again, this notion of invoking, an icon of Finnish modernism of international importance, which is almost a hopeless project, but it'll be successful. Persuading the city of Oulu to put the money in to restore the building, which they should do anyway, and in the process allowing this cultural organization to create a gallery, a workshop center, and of course they have, Eritreans, Senegalese, Syrians working in the project as co-workers. There's no sense of, oh, you're refugees, we will help you. Brilliant project. But invoking that, and I can say it as a foreigner, that extraordinary spirit of Finnish enterprise and creativity. You did it in the 30s, you invented new forms, you can continue to invent new forms. Why not? Voilà.
And we learned there that Finland is not part of Scandinavia.
We were
It's
told
part of
very
Sweden.
We're not part of Sweden.
It is Scando-Finland.
Scandinavia.
But actually, we have some interesting example in Finland.
I'm sure.
I mean, Miina, this woman who you're sleeping under her blankets, the
Oh dear.
cow pattern. I mean, she's dealing with real cows, trying to have these cows live very close to the Helsinki center, and having a lot of problems with city government and so on. And normal people think she's kind of crazy, it's not very simple.
But we crazies know she's absolutely not.
So we thank you.
Thanks for listening.
I think
Thank you very much.
gives us, we have to, in some reasonable time, AmosLAB has to perhaps head towards Oulu.
I think that
To meet these people.
I recommend
And to have something together
I would recommend it.
to talk about.
Because we're inviting them to England to give to our next, So there you go. Out of northern Finland comes the future.
Maybe it was lucky that Nokia went out of there.
There's
There's a lot of things happening now because
It's
of
interesting
on the ruins of Nokia.
It's because when people say Nokia, it's like almost like it's an apology. Did something go wrong? Did something happen? Like they say Nokia. They don't say Nokia. There's something happened.
We should make some art piece out of this.
You mean the future didn't work?
The future didn't work.
Oh, too bad.
They were really future enough.
But this organisation calls itself Powerhouse.
Yeah, Powerhouse.
It is taking over the spaces that Nokia was there.
Sure.
But just one little correction, not a correction, just a little anecdote to finish on, because this is your, yesterday was your Independence Day, 1917, which of course, of course, that Lenin, who I believe was partly responsible. Partly, okay.
Besides the paper.
Okay, that he was also in the Dada Cabaret in Zurich. Wait for it. He lived in the same street. Spiegelgasse. February 1916, and you have all these crazy artists from all over Europe, mad artists in this cabaret, and Lenin was in the audience. And the theory is, Lenin wanted to be a Dada. He got it wrong and made the Russian Revolution.
I have to make some research on this.
Thank you very much.
Joo,